Okay, in this demonstration, I want to show you how you can get started with a logo creation using Photoshop, vector tools, and typography. So first of all, let's jump over here to my desktop, and I've got a folder that I'm beginning with. You can name it whatever you want, but the ultimate idea is that it's my fourth project where I'm going to keep all my files. And the first thing that I did was I drew several iterations of different logos, and I scanned in the one that I ultimately decided that I wanted to work with. Yours doesn't have to be beautiful. This isn't beautiful, but what I'm going to use this as is a tracing outline for my vector shape, and it gives me an idea kind of how I'd like to have my arrangement. And like I said, I don't want you to just do one drawing. I want you to do many drawings, and I think that I tell you a number of drawings that you should be doing so that you have lots of different iterations of ideas, and then that way you're not just settling on the first thing that you come across. So anyway, this is the one that I finally decided on. I went ahead and I scanned it in. You can take a picture with your phone, whatever. Anyway, I scanned this in, and I'm going to bring this into Photoshop. So I'm going to right-click this. You could either right-click and say Open With. That's one thing. On a Mac, you can also just drag it and open it in Photoshop. And it's going to be my background, and there's some different ways that you could approach this. First of all, in my notes, I'd made some mentions of different types of kind of styles that I was interested in for the type. This sans serif is kind of okay. I don't think that I want a serif, but I also don't know that I want just a simple sans serif like this. So what I'm going to suggest later is that we go do some type investigations. And what you might end up deciding in your process is you might end up deciding to go and find the type first before you do your drawing of your icon that's going to be the mark that accompanies your word mark. So there's some different ways that you can think about marks. And when I say mark, I'm talking about logos, but the word logo means something specific. There are different types of logo marks. There's a word mark. A word mark would be just the word itself. Like if I were to remove the mountain completely and I just had something that said Spire Outdoor Adventures, that would be a word mark as my brand identity. Well, not my identity, but as my mark for the identity. If I had just letters that represented, like if it was SOA, for instance, that would be considered a letter mark. If I just had the mountains, that's considered like a graphic logo or graphic mark. If I had a combination, it's a combination mark where I've got like a word mark or a letter mark in combination with a visual icon. All right, and so there's some different ways that companies will have these things, and you'll probably hear about this more in other classes, but we're going to briefly talk about it now too, because regardless of whether you're taking this class as a graphic designer or an artist or web designer or videographer or whatever, the chances are that you're either going to be designing graphic marks or logos for other people, or if you're your own brand, you're going to have to create something for yourself that represents your own identity as a designer. And so this is a really good thing for you to be working on anyway. So the thing is, a lot of people decide that they need some kind of visual icon that represents their company. And I would say that unless you're a very well established company, you really probably do need, in some way, shape, or form, the word that comprises the name of the company in addition to a visual icon until you're well established. So you can kind of create a guide that allows the icon to be used separately from the words or have them together. You can also say that they always have to be together. These are some of the guidelines that you can always work out with your client, but the idea is that unless somebody's pretty well established, you probably want to give them an option to have their visual icon also working with the company name or their lettermark so that it's really clear that there's some other point of reference besides just a graphic. All right, that's just something that's a way to think about people who are just getting started and don't have that immediate brand recognition through their graphic logo. So anyway, this is what I've got to start with in this fictitious company called Spire Outdoor Adventures. And the first thing I would like to start with, and I'm not going to start with the drawing in terms of the mountain. I actually want to start with the typography because the type is super important. You could start drawing this if you wanted, but I think that I'm going to start with the type, so that I have an idea. Maybe if I decide later I want the mountains to be softer looking, or if I want them to be, as angular as they are, some of that might depend on the type that I choose. You could go the opposite way and say, hey, the icon is super important, and so I need to choose the type based on the icon. Either way is okay, but just be aware that typography is so important that you might consider looking for your typographical style before you settle completely on the stylistic nature of how you draw out your logo. So, or your graphic mark. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to jump over to Google, and you can come over to fonts.google.com to look at Google Fonts. We've talked about Google Fonts before in this class, but you can always find free fonts here. The other thing too is that you can use Adobe's Typekit, and that's fine, but a lot of the fonts that you're going to find in Typekit are not going to allow you to use them for free. So just be aware of that. You're welcome to use the Typekit options, but as I said again, if you want to be able to go from computer to computer without any problems, you might consider looking at something that's free. It's really all up to you. Now, we've talked about Google Fonts, but I haven't really talked very much yet about DaFont. And there are lots of other free font companies, websites where you can go. I'm just going to go ahead and show you DaFont. They have a lot of different, like so many different options that sometimes it's hard to even weed through them because it's so much. And some of them are pretty interesting. They're pretty good, and some of them are not so great. But one thing I do like about DaFont here, and here's kind of where I deviate a little bit. A lot of times when I'm looking for something that's free, that's going to be kind of like a tried and true, I guess, more traditional type of font, whether it's serif, sans serifs, monospace, whatever, or fixed width, whatever you want to call it. A lot of times I'll start with Google Fonts because it's got really good filtering, but also I just find that they're very well designed. The stuff at DaFont is also well designed, but sometimes you'll find stuff that's a little funky. And so I tend to like Google Fonts for consistency a little bit more when I'm trying to find something that's a little bit more tried and true. But if I'm looking for something that's kind of edgier, sometimes on Google Fonts, I'll pop off these and I'll maybe take off monospace, serif, and sans serif, and I'll leave display and handwriting on to see what kinds of options I've got. And sometimes you'll find what you need, but I also find that these are going to be used a whole lot, whereas sometimes DaFont fonts are not used as much. Now, if you're doing something that's a full campaign, when I say full campaign, I mean if it's something that's going to have to be used across all platforms, then Google Fonts is a really good resource. And the reason is because you can download these fonts and use them for free without any kind of attribution stuff. You can use these for free in both print and they are also web hosted. That's a really important distinction. A lot of times people don't know the difference between using a web hosted font versus downloading a font, and those are two specifically different types of licenses. So if you go to Google Fonts, anything that you find on Google Fonts is going to be available as a downloadable thing that you can use in print, but also Google Fonts has free hosting of the font so that you can use it as a true web font, and without having to like host it yourself. You just refer to it and it'll pull up your fonts. DaFont doesn't. That's not necessarily going to be true with the stuff that you find here. So just be aware that if you're going to choose something where you need it to be in true text on the web, like for instance, if you need it to be highlightable text that would otherwise be editable, not that someone's going to edit your text on the web. But if you need it to be highlightable so that it can be copied and it's not just a picture image or something like that or an SVG, then you might consider using Google Fonts. But if you are using it for a logo that really you're not so worried about it being web hosted, then you could go and try to find something for, that's for free on DaFont. So anyway, I'm on DaFont, and I like the idea. If you take a look at this, I like the idea of maybe trying to do something that's a little edgy. All right, this is outdoor adventures. Maybe I want to think of extreme sports, you know. And so these are some of the notes that I had written down for myself. I jotted down of some of the values, you know, like excitement, adventure, sort of edginess. And so like that's where some of these sharp angles come into play. And I might be looking for a font that might be kind of like that. And so, you know, one of the things that I might do is I might look, say, in like Gothic, modern, for instance, or I could look under various or whatever, right? And so I could take a look, and you know, some of these are really interesting. Like, you know, this kind of reminds me, where it's the one that's called Reposed. This isn't the right one for me. For this particular brand, but it's an interesting font that could work for something else like a skateboard brand, or I don't know, whatever, something like that. But it's not necessarily what I'm looking for. And so, you know, I would go through these, but you'll see down at the bottom, for instance, that you've got like a lot of different pages that you go through. So I, here's the deal. When you're looking for the right font, it's going to take time. If it's something that's important and not, you know, you're not just trying to rush through it because it's some project and you're on a deadline, you just got to be done by tomorrow night, you know, if it's for a real client, you need to spend some serious time looking for the right typeface. You know, you can look for all different kinds of things on here, and you know, some of these are really good for very specific applications, and some of them are just over the top, right? And so most of these are a little over the top for me. And so you could also say, all right, well, let's go to basic and let's look at sans serifs, and you could go through their sans serifs and like see, like this one is pretty interesting, lemon milk, right? It kind of fits the bill a little bit for some of my desires, you know, in terms of like sharpness. It's also very modern looking. Another thing that's really important for what I want to do is it's easy to read. You want to look for good legibility. And when I say legibility versus readability, readability is more about like a block of text. How easy is it to read a longer block of text? Legibility is something that pertains a little bit more like to headlines and headings and things that need to have immediate, like at a glance recognition. You need to be able to read it really fast, understand it, recognize it, and consume that product, right? So this has really good readability, I think. And one of the things you can do is go up here where it says preview, and you can type the word that you want. Now, you can see I've typed Spire, Outdoor Adventure, but you'll also notice it's got a history of the things that I've typed to look for it. And you'll notice that I've done different caps, right? And so instead of typing all caps, a lot of these are all caps, and a really easy way to know if something is all caps is just type it in lowercase. And if it's in all caps, you're going to know that for sure. Another way to look at it is if you have an initial cap, you can see whether or not, like even something that is in all caps, sometimes the initial cap will have a different version of that uppercase, right? And so you could do something like that too. And then go ahead and refresh, and then you'll see what the word is specifically that you're looking for. And you know, lemon milk is still interesting, but it's less interesting in these letters. I really liked the M letter form, but I don't have an M in my word here, so maybe that's not the right one, but I might download it anyway and put it into my font management system and then try it out. And when I say font management system, I'm on a Mac, and so it comes with FontBook. If you don't have a paid subscription to a font management system like Extensis's, you know, Suitcase or something like that, then if you're on a Mac, you can use FontBook. If you're on Windows and you don't have it, you don't have to use a font management system. You can just right-click the font that you download and install it. All right, that's another option. Just make sure that you put the font in a place where you're not going to delete it later, because you still would need this. Caviar Dreams is nice, and that could, you know, maybe not for my heading, but it could also be good maybe for the outdoor adventures part, because I think that I like the idea. In my drawing you see that it's lowercase down here, and I think that what might be kind of a nice foil to having something that's edgy and sharp for the name brand, where it says Outdoor Adventures as the subtitle, I might like to have that in something that's kind of like rounded letters to give it a little bit more of a softness and openness, so it's not all angles and sharpness and painful looking, right? And so that could be a nice combination. This might be nice, although the letter form of the R, might lose some of its readability once you get it small. Another thing is if you want to see how it scales, you can also go to tiny, small, medium, large, and you can see if your word is going to scale well, because some of these typefaces, while they might look really cool big, they might look terrible small. And so anyway, I went ahead and I looked through all of these and I downloaded several fonts, and to prevent you from having to watch me do my own process of elimination, I went ahead and decided on something, and I'll show you what that is. And I did get it from DaFont, by the way.